Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. First of all, it won't surprise people to know the government's opposing the resolution in front of us, but I think, given the comments we just made, I think it's important for me to explain why, in the view of the government, that we are pressing the timelines on this. And it's important, given that this has been raised, and I will pay respect to the manager of the opposition business. This is an appropriate use of a suspension, absolutely. This is not just to blow up the parliament. It's an argument about delay that those opposite have put publicly and now putting within the parliament. A few things were said, so I want to explain why the government does have a timetable where we want to be able to get this in front of the Senate when the Senate returns. And to be able to do that, that means it going through the House this week. And this resolution, obviously, if carried, would mean that it couldn't go through the House this week and, in fact, couldn't go through the House at all this year. Reference was made a few times in the contributions that were just made to the reforms of the Hawke and Keating years. And those opposite, when they talk about those years, often only talk about the beginning of that time with the accord where you effectively had the trade-off of wages in return for the social wage. What they rarely talk about, those opposite, and certainly didn't come in that debate, was what happened in the later part of that period in terms of enterprise bargaining. Because it was at that moment that you had a way of wages moving forward and productivity moving forward. So the trade-off concept of wages versus social wage no longer had to occur, and you had a serious shift to be able to get wages moving in enterprise agreements. And the 14% figure that they referred to is not the 14% figure that I'm really mindful of. The 14% figure I'm really mindful of is that is a percentage of the workforce that is on enterprise agreements that are currently in date. That is a huge part of the story of low wage growth over the last 10 years. Now, there have been attempts, and those opposite have said, oh, well, they introduced legislation to try to get agreements moving, and that's true. In the Omnibus bill, they did do something that would have potentially caused more agreements. But their way of getting more agreements was to suspend for 2 years the better off overall test. So their way of getting more agreements was to keep the productivity dividend and get rid of the wages part of the equation, to allow wages to go backwards in order to get more agreements. Now, that was never a sensible way, and it simply would have made the problem that Australians face right now so much worse if you'd been allowed to have the one way of getting wages above awards become a pathway for wages, in fact, to be below award levels. And that was their approach to getting more agreements. Our approach to getting more agreements is to do a couple of things that make a fundamental difference. The first is to reform how the better off overall test works. Now, that's in this bill. Business has been calling for this for a long time. Had this been the only thing the government had put in the Omnibus bill when that came through last time, they would have had legislation that could have been supported, because they would have had legislation that in no way drove wages down. But effectively, what is in this bill, in terms of the rejigging of the better off overall test, is a way of making sure that if someone is found to fall below it, then the Commission has the power to fix it for that individual rather than blow up the whole agreement. The reality that you could end up with the whole agreement being blown up has been a key reason why a whole lot of employers have just said this system's too complex and have walked away from it. And as they've walked away from it, the productivity benefits haven't been made available for them, and at the same time as the productivity benefits haven't been made available, the wage rises haven't happened either. It was amusing, as someone from a small business family who's run his own small business, being told as I sat there that nobody on this side has run their own business, while I'm sitting there having run my own, sitting beside someone who's run his own business. But I'll tell you one thing that I'll never forget, a manager at Kmart telling me at one point, was going through the Kmart agreement and saying to me how good it was to have an agreement that took out all the rubbish in the award that was irrelevant to their workplace and just had a document where every paragraph was relevant. And I remember hearing that conversation and thinking, well, for the business I used to run, and certainly for the business my dad used to run, we never had a chance of that simplicity, because we never had an HR department, and we never had a chance of an HR department. And the only way you would have a pathway to that simplicity is if similar businesses could just hire the one consultant and bargain together. It's the only chance you ever have of getting a document, that will work in those ways. And I hear those opposite. Shadow Treasurer. It's amusing that he clearly hasn't looked at any of the businesses that have called for this. He hasn't looked at the Victorian childcare centres that have called for exactly this. He hasn't looked at the sheet metal operators who have called for exactly this. He hasn't looked at the cleaning companies where, when they've tried to get an agreement and what has then happened, you get an agreement in place, some new operator comes in, completely undercuts, and the good employer who wants to compete on grounds like better equipment, compete on grounds like smarter operations, compete on grounds like quality of service, finds themselves straight away losing their contracts because they're competing on grounds of a race to the bottom on wages. There's plenty of good employers who would like to be able to have the certainty of delivering the sort of pay they know in their current business operations they can offer without being undercut in a race to the bottom on wages. As long as you don't open up multi-employer bargaining, you always will have that problem. So if you go, and he's there again, it's going to force it up, it'll force it. Yeah, wages will go up. Wages will go up. And those opposite, having spent 10 years determined to keep wages down, are now saying, well, can't we keep wages down for a couple more months? Well, can I tell you, in terms of dealing with wages, and sorry, Shadow Treasurer, he's saying, I said prices, yet the quotation says it pushes up wages. It pushes up wages.
The member for Hume will cease interjecting.
So those opposite have wanted to continue, having had 10 years of deliberately keeping wages down, and now saying, can't we have a few more months? Can't we have a few more months? And what would happen if it went through to January? They'd have another reason. Can't this bit be delayed a bit further? Can't we keep delaying it? Because that has been the experience of workers. And can I tell you, if inflation is now running at 7.3 and projected to get to 8%, I can't think of a time, certainly in my working life, where delay had a greater impact on households around Australia. So I'll leave it at this, because I did see members of the crossbench jumping when I jumped, and I don't want to use up all the time. But allow me to simply say the government is determined to get wages moving. We are in the hands of the Senate as to when this legislation gets through. I want to make sure that we have the legislation in front of them as soon as the Senate returns, and we will continue to push for wages to get moving, because households that are feeling the pinch of higher prices need to see improvements in wages after 10 years of them being held back.